Hi, and welcome to this presentation called Talking Across Difference, Some Tips for the Election, Thanksgiving, and Beyond. I'm Donna Kaplowitz, and I am one of the co-directors of the program on intergroup relations at the University of Michigan. This presentation was first developed for my students, my undergraduate students who were going home at Thanksgiving for the first time after having their eyes open to many of the social inequalities in our society, and they were confronting situations that they were unprepared to talk about. And so I wanted to give them some skills to bring to the Thanksgiving table. And I hope that these are useful for you as well. I encourage you to have a piece of paper handy because there's a few places in the presentation where I ask you to write some things down. And you can feel free to pause the video at any time to look more closely at a slide. I'm also happy to share all of the information and the PowerPoint with you. Just email me and the information will be at the end of the presentation. So we'll get started. So my goals for today are to learn how to talk across difference about something that really matters to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about dialogue versus debate and about spheres of influence. So those are some dialogic things that we do in intergroup dialogue. I'm going to invite you to recognize your triggers or your charges, that feeling you get when your sense of social justice has been violated. I'm going to invite you to understand some principles to stay in productive dialogue. And so we're going to be looking at de-escalation techniques, identifying values, dignity, perspective taking, timing, and more. And then we're going to develop some premeditated responses to jokes, microaggressions, and bias in general. So you'll have some tools for your toolkit. I want to begin by saying that this is really hard work. Talking across difference about things that really matter to us are some of the hardest things that we can do in life. We're asking people to challenge their previously held beliefs, and that's just really hard. So don't expect it to happen in the course of one conversation. Sometimes it takes weeks, months, or even years. I'm going to invite you to take out a piece of paper and pencil and write down 2 or 3 bullet points that you might use to convince somebody to change their mind about something that really matters to you. I give you a list of ideas on the right-hand side of the screen, but surely everybody is here because they have something that really matters to them and they want to learn how to talk across difference. So write down 2 or 3 bullet points that you would use to try and convince somebody to change their mind. We're going to talk for a minute about dialogue versus debate because this is core to what we do in intergroup dialogue. And I want to begin by saying that dialogue and debate are both forms of communication that are very useful in their own place, but we're going to focus on what the difference is, and I'm going to encourage you to stay on the dialogic side of this equation when you're having these difficult conversations with people that matter to you. So we define dialogue as a form of communication between 2 or more people that is directed toward common understanding. I like to say that it's adding to the common pool of knowledge. Debate is a form of communication between 2 or more people where an issue is discussed and opposing arguments are presented. The goal of dialogue is to grow together, and the goal of debate is to win and prove the other person is wrong. Dialogue assumes that many people have the answer and only together can we find a solution. And debate, again, assumes that there's one right answer and that you have it. Ultimately, dialogue uses listening very differently than debate. In dialogue, when we're engaged with other people, we learn through listening and we discover new ideas by practicing what I like to call generous listening. In debate, we listen long enough just to find flaws in other people's arguments and to counter them. This diagram illustrates what dialogue is in a nutshell. So this is a picture of blindfolded scientists, each of whom have one small piece of this elephant, and they all think they know what it is. The scientist on the end has the tail and he thinks he's discovered a rope. The scientist on the top of the elephant has the ear and they believe they've discovered a fan. And so when it's not until all of the scientists put all of the information together that they can build a bigger picture of what their reality is. And that's really a metaphor for what dialogue is about, all of us adding to the common pool of knowledge. We also talk about spheres of influence in dialogue, and each of us has 4 different spheres that we belong to. The first is ourselves, what we do to educate ourselves. The second sphere is close friends and family. The third sphere is our workplace, our social media, our sports networks, our religious places, and so on, just a little bit beyond close friends and family. And the fourth sphere is larger community, like city, state, and nation. In each of these spheres, there's things that we can do to try and create more social justice. So for today, we're going to talk about and focus on interrupting oppression in the second sphere, close friends and family. A lot of my students think that this is really the hardest place to operate because these are the people that you care most about and that whose opinions of you matter and relationships matter. So learning how to stay in dialogue about things that matter to you with people who matter to you is really hard. But I also believe that it's one of the best ways that we can create change. It's around our dinner table. It's what we're talking about and how we call people in instead of calling people out. So one of the things that's very useful to know when you're doing this work is to be aware of what your own triggers or hot button issues are, what pushes your buttons and makes you upset. We define triggers or charges as something that an individual says or does that makes us feel offended, threatened, stereotyped, discounted, or attacked. It's not necessarily a threat to our physical safety, but our psychological safety is at threat. Our sense of justice feels violated and it activates our fight, flight, or freeze response. So just being aware of what your triggers are and recognizing them and recognizing that sensation in your body when you're feeling charged is something that you can do to steer yourself to recognize and then to move away from your initial response and towards something that's premeditated and more in line with staying in dialogue. It's important to remember that the key to getting someone to open their mind is to be gentle. I know this goes against so many of our gut reactions, but that's sort of the bottom line of this work. I'm going to step out of my own comfort zone for a minute and talk about our brain and our amygdala, because I think it's very useful to understand what's happening in our brain when we feel that charged sensation of social justice violation. So the amygdala is an ancient part of our brain that drives our emotional functioning. It's involved in the initial processing of emotions like fear, anger, excitement, or violations of social justice. And so what we want to do is, instead of allowing that initial fight, flight, or freeze response, we want to take our brain back and go to our neocortex, where our rational response resides. And we want to call upon that to respond instead of our amygdala response. So I call that overriding our hijacked amygdala. So think of a time when something or someone pushed your buttons, you felt really charged. And I'm going to invite you in this slide to look at typical trigger responses. So there's a number of ways that we typically respond when our amygdala is hijacked. We may argue or attack or analyze or walk away. We may be silent. We may shout or yell. There's all different ways that we have learned to respond when that moment occurs. What I would like to invite you to do is to recognize where in your body you feel it so that you know it and you can name it. And then pick another response that allows you to stay in that dialogic space that continues the conversation with whomever you're with. So some of the things, and I've starred them on this list, that might allow you, when you realize, oh my God, I get that feeling in my stomach because somebody just said something that's really offensive to me, is to name it. You can say, what you just said triggered me. I feel really uncomfortable. My own daughter used this at the dinner table once, and it changed the conversation immediately because we knew that she was feeling really charged. Getting curious is always a really good response. Discussing it, talking about it, leaning into it. Those are all things that are going to be conducive to keeping you in dialogue and not having things escalate. All right, we're going to talk now about principles for staying in productive conversation, and we're going to look at a variety of different things that we can use to stay in productive conversation. This old adage, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, is sort of in a nutshell exactly what we're talking about today. Though it's an old saying, it's backed by now lots and lots of research. We get more accomplished when we treat people with kindness and we de-escalate situations. So we don't want to fight fire with fire. We don't want to escalate when we feel something is starting to steam. We lose control. When we start shouting, we lose. And so it's really important to try to de-escalate and to select one of those preferable trigger responses so that you can stay in that dialogic space. You also don't want to confirm other people's ideas about you, or potentially ideas about liberals being hot-headed or unpredictable. So we want to de-escalate when something comes up. That doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It means learning how to lean into the conflict and use it in a productive way. One of the things that we can do is listen generously to others. When you give people your full attention and practice authentic curiosity, you're giving them a gift of really being heard. And sometimes when people feel heard, they're then it allows them to open up and give you some attention as well. So you want to give people your full attention and validate them. It is important to be nice, and we know from the old saying, but we also know from a lot of the research, and I've listed at the bottom of this slide some of the important researchers who have looked at this. But when people feel threatened, they can't listen. They reinforce their positions. They dig their heels in. When you get really pushed, your response is to push back. So remembering that is really important when we're doing this work. Another thing to pay attention to is your own core values and the core values of the people that you're talking to. So when we know what our core values are, it really can help us respond, but we often respond using our core values and not the values of the person that you're talking to. I'm going to invite you to take a look at this list. It's rather lengthy. I've developed it after years and years of collecting values from my students. I invite them to, at the beginning of the semester, look at this list and identify what their values are so that they can make decisions based upon their own values. They usually pick 2 to 5 and write a small paragraph about them. I invite them to visit the list at the end of the semester as well. So I suggest that you take a little bit of time looking at this list and identifying your values, and so that you know where you're coming from. But the important thing to remember is that where you're coming from informs you, but when you're talking across difference, you need to know where the other person is coming from. So there's some really useful work around what typical conservative values are and typical liberal values are. Conservative values tend to be in-group loyalty, being very loyal to your group, respect for authority, protection of purity and sanctity, religion, patriotism, traditionalism, meritocracy. Those are all important conservative values. Liberal values tend to be more around issues of equity and equality, protection from harm, taking care of people, fairness, both benevolence, nurturance, and social justice. So it's very important for you to be aware of what the person to whom you're speaking, what they value, so that you can then address them with their value framework. So some of the examples that I give here are using conservative values to address issues that might be important to you. For a conservative person, telling them that it's not fair that the Trump administration has stopped refugees at the border and divided families, it might be more useful to talk to them about family values and how it goes against core family values to separate families. Or you could take what George Bush said and suggest that, religion says that we're all God's people, so we should treat everyone that way. Equal rights for same-sex couples, rather than saying it's just not fair for same-sex couples not to have the same rights as heterosexual couples. It might be more convincing to somebody with conservative values to identify the fact that, they have strong family values, and that in fact data shows us that Divorce rates are lower for same-sex couples than for heterosexual couples. It's also useful sometimes to share stories about yourself or about people that you know, if you have permission. It makes it more real. So go back to your original writing about how you might try to convince someone and reframe it from the perspective of using conservative values. And see how that feels and try it. It's hard to twist your mind that way, but it's a very useful skill to remember when you're talking to somebody with really different values. They don't care about yours, they care about theirs. Another thing to keep in mind is some work that came out of Harvard professor Donna, who wrote a book called Dignity. And she is a researcher who studies international conflict. She's worked in some of the most entrenched conflicts in the world, in the Middle East, in Ireland, in Central America. And she boils down these years and years of experience mediating international conflict to one word: dignity. People want to be treated with dignity. Dignity is a birthright, she says, and it means that we have inherent value and worth. Brené Brown likes to point out that human beings are biologically and psychologically hardwired for connection. We want to be seen, we want to be known, and we want to connect to other people. So when our dignity is violated, that is the heart of conflict between people. I thought about this when Hillary Clinton in 2016 called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, and thought, oh no, that is the last thing that she should say, because it totally pushes people away. People want to feel respected. So when we treat people with dignity, it means that we're assuming that they're doing their best. This is something that I have to think about a lot. Like, are they really doing their best? I don't always know if they are, but I think I'm a better person when I believe that people are doing their best. My goal is to stay connected and engaged, not to talk down to people, but help people feel like they really matter, that they're seen, and that they belong. Treat people fairly and as trustworthy, and apologize when necessary. And we at IGR believe that it's really important right from the start to learn how to apologize, because when we do social justice work, it's risky and scary, and we make mistakes. And so learning how to say I'm sorry is one of the first things that we want to teach our students. Another thing to keep in mind is perspective taking, inviting people to step into somebody else's shoes. We wonder, can we really change people's minds? There was a really interesting study by David Brookman out of Berkeley on transgender issues during the last presidential election cycle. There was a major ballot initiative in Florida at the time, and he sent 50 people out into the field and talked to over 500 Floridians at their door, inviting them to talk about the transgender ballot issue. And what he did was he began by asking them for a time when they themselves felt as though they were not seen or understood, when their rights were being violated. And when he ignited that perspective taking in people's minds, he then shared a video of transgender people talking about what it's like not to be able to use the bathroom of their choice. And just that 10-minute interaction at people's doors led people to be more inclined to vote for the transgender issue. And when he went back 3 months later, it stayed that people still supported the transgender issue. Another thing that we can do is be vulnerable ourselves. People respond to social sensitivity. When people are skilled at being socially sensitive, which means intuiting how other people feel based upon their tone of voice, expressions, or nonverbal cues, they feel more open to talking. There's a great online study that you can take called Reading the Mind's Eye. It's a little test. It tells you how proficient you are at intuiting how other people feel. But and if you score low, that's fine, because they also believe that it's a skill that we can learn. So being socially sensitive creates a psychological safety where people are more likely to take risks and challenge their previously held beliefs. I encourage you to watch Brené Brown's famous TED Talk on vulnerability because she really gets at the heart of this. Timing is also important. When do we interrupt biased comments? One of the things that we've learned over time is that when we publicly shame people, their brains, their amygdala is hijacked, and they can't learn, and they can't challenge their previously held beliefs. And so oftentimes it's better to wait until you have a private moment with somebody to share, what your concerns are about something that they said. The caveat to that is that sometimes it is important to mention gently, call people in, and challenge something that they said in front of other people, because you're modeling for other people how to do it in a kind and respectful way. And then finally, remember that this work can take a really long time. So don't set yourself up for hoping that you're going to create change this Thanksgiving. It can take years and years, and that's okay. That's what we need to do. Another thing to remember is that you should pick your battles. So you can't win every argument. That's not the goal. The goal is to stay connected and to gently move people ahead. Sometimes it's not worth it. And sometimes for your own self-care, it's better to choose not to engage in that particular situation. So choose when you want to respond. All right, now we're going to turn to some tools for interrupting oppression, and I call it developing your oppression toolbox. I'm going to introduce you to something called PALS, which you can employ in a variety of situations, and we'll look specifically at responding to jokes and to microaggressions. PALS is an approach that I developed a number of years ago. You can find this infographic on IGR's website. But we're going to talk through the approach. It's intended to help people when their amygdala is hijacked and everything that they had prepared and thought they knew flies out of their brain because somebody said something so offensive. So it's supposed to be really easy to recall. PALS stands for the following things. Pause. P stands for pause. And it's just slowing the conversation down. Somebody said something super offensive, and your first initial response is just to slow things down. You could say, "Excuse me, I'm just wondering about what you just said." And sometimes this is as far as you get in interrupting oppression, and that's okay. It takes a lot of practice, and just interrupting it like that is fine. A actually stands for both acknowledge and ask. Acknowledge what the person is saying. That sends a message that you're trying to make meaning out of what the person is saying, even if it's at odds with something that you believe. It shows that core respect for dignity and interest in collaboration, getting curious, staying in dialogue. What it sounds like is, what I hear you saying is, or I appreciate your thinking on this. Have you thought of something else? And then the ask is the second part of this. Ask for clarification, get curious, make sure you understand what the person said. Sometimes the person has misspoken, or when it's said back to them, they realize that they really don't want to own that, and they are willing, if you gently approach them, to reconsider their position. So let them know what you think you heard them say. Ask them, why do you think that? You can say, I think you just said that Syrian refugees are terrorists. Do you mean that? Here, tone is really important. Listen to the difference between these two ways of asking. I think you said that Syrian refugees are all terrorists. Is that what you mean? Versus, I think you just said that Syrian refugees are terrorists. Is that what you mean? It's really different. And so when you reflect that back to them, it gives them a chance to think about their position. Then L stands for listen. And again, this is a core skill in dialogue. Listen to what the person said. Sometimes just listening is the most important thing you can do to continue to engage the person. Get genuinely curious. Ask them where they learned that, how they think they know that. When you give people the opportunity to be heard, that gives them the opportunity to think and to potentially open up their minds. The last thing in PALS is S, stands for speak your truth. Share your concern with what the person said. Be vulnerable. Share your learning. What we know is that stories, when you share a story, people are going to remember it 22 times longer than they remember facts. I used to say S stands for shared data, but we're living in a time where we can't even agree on facts. And also, the research is telling me that sharing stories is more effective than sharing long lists of facts. So, something that you could say is calling Muslims terrorists perpetuates an unfair stereotype that hurts many good, patriotic, that's invoking a really important conservative value, hardworking people who practice a religion that's different from yours. It also makes me feel terrible because my best friend is Muslim, and then you share your story. So that pals is one way that you can have in your back pocket when your amygdala is hijacked to respond when you hear something offensive. We're going to turn to talking about microaggressions now, and I'm going to define it, and then we're going to talk about how to handle them. Microaggressions are everyday encounters of subtle discrimination that people of various marginalized identities experience throughout their lives. They may be intentional or unconscious. They generally communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative ideas. They are subtle put downs, and they may be verbal or nonverbal. Oftentimes, when we're microaggressed, we are left wondering, did I really understand what they were saying? What were they saying? Am I making too much out of this? That's the kind of thing that that is sort of the definition of microaggressions. And Daryl Wing Su out of Columbia University is one of the foremost thinkers on microaggressions. So some examples of microaggressions might be, you don't act like a insert the blank. Don't all your people blank. So lumping people together in simple stereotypes. A very common one that our students report hearing are, where are you really from? Especially referring to people whose identities you can't readily put your finger on. So when we're categorizing people in our heads, we might want to say, where are you really from? But that's a microaggression. What are you? This is a microaggression that my daughter used to get all the time. She has olive toned skin and she's ambiguous racially. And so people would ask her, what are you? Which is really offensive. It's treating her as an object and not a person. Another way that microaggression shows up in a nonverbal sense is when we avoid eye contact with people whom we don't feel comfortable around. So some strategies to address microaggressions include, first and foremost, taking deep breaths. And this is true for just about any of these situations, but really practicing deep breathing, 2 feet on the floor and deep breaths can really help. It slows things down. Assume that the person has good intentions. Employ pals, which we just talked about. Speak your truth. Name what happened. My daughter might say, you just asked me, what am I? That makes me feel like you don't think I'm human. Calmly share your experience. When you talk about my religion that way, it makes me feel unseen. Identify support networks. So this goes to ways that you can help yourself when you're not necessarily in the moment of a microaggression, but check in with other people and say, I had this experience and I'm really trying to make sense out of it. How do you see it? And gather ideas and information and make sure that you take care of yourselves, because we know that microaggressions can be can have actual public health consequences. Turning to jokes, humor is one of the ways that microaggression shows up very frequently, as does bias. People love to say, can't you take a joke as a way to criticize people who stand up against offensive jokes. But humor is something that is really useful to premeditate. How do you want to show up when somebody tells an offensive joke and you're in the room? I like to share a story about something that happened in my life. I was 16 years old, very long time ago. I had the best job. I was making $4 an hour in the pathology department at the University of Michigan Hospital, more than any of my friends. And I had a boss who was racist. And just to give away how old I am, we used to go sit in a smoking lounge during our breaks. And Phyllis would say, she would tell jokes if there were only white people in the room. So I went home to my parents and I said, look, I really don't want to lose my job. I have a great job, but I really can't stand Phyllis's jokes and I don't know what to say. So we actually practiced a response. The next time I was in the room with Phyllis and she started in on her racist jokes, I said in a really quiet, quivering voice, I don't think that's very funny. And what happened was Phyllis then turned the jokes on me and began to say, oh, I can't tell this joke because Donna's in the room. I went back home and told my parents it didn't work. She's still telling the jokes, just not when I'm present. And my parents said, actually, it did work because Phyllis learned that not all white people are in on it. It's really important. That was a huge lesson for me. And it's important to counter these subtle and not so subtle forms of oppression. So thinking in advance about how you want to respond. In my case, we actually role played and I went in and played out what I had role played with my parents, is a very useful thing. Making a commitment that you're not going to let all of the kinds of jokes you hear go by. So you can premeditate your response and you can think, the next time I hear an offensive joke, I'm going to first decide, is this an appropriate time to respond? Some people like humor and respond to jokes with sarcasm. Some people want to just be honest, like I did. I don't think it's funny because Black people have had it really hard in this country and it's not funny to tell jokes about them. You can get curious or play dumb. Can you explain to me why that's funny? I just don't get it. You can be silent. Crickets. People don't like that. People who tell jokes want a response. And so if they don't get a response, they might not tell a joke. I think the important thing here is remembering to premeditate your response so that when you're in the heat of the moment, you remember that you want to respond in some way, but respond in a way that calls people in and doesn't make them feel completely isolated. So 9 things to remember about talking across difference. Stay engaged. That's our goal, to stay engaged. Recognize your own triggers and plan in advance. Learn other people's values and practice moral reframing so that you're talking to people with their value lens, not your own. Treat people with dignity. Introduce perspective taking. Invite people to remember a time when they themselves have been left out, and that might make them feel more sympathetic to whatever group they're targeting. Choose your battles. You don't have to fight every single one. Pick your timing. When is the most appropriate time to respond? Practice pals, and premeditate your response. So plan ahead. How do you want to show up when jokes, microaggressions, or bias are present? So I often give my students quotes to live by. And one of the salient ones right now is, our lives begin to end when we become silent about things that matter, Martin Luther King. I just think that it's really important to think through how you want to respond and respond in a way that stays engaged instead of alienating people. So here are some of the sources that I used in preparing this presentation. And they're certainly available. You can email me and I'm happy to send the PowerPoint to you. But I hope that you have found this a useful expenditure of your precious time and that you have some successes. And I'd love to hear from you if you try anything that works. And certainly if you have ideas for me that were not included in this presentation. Thank you.